Hey, I'm back with another low quality video. For this video, Connor and I will be dropping some spicy
knowledge.
That's right, spicy
Knowledge.
Spicy enough to set up the fire alarm on the Hansberry v. Lee case and the life of Lauren Hansberry herself. And just saying, there's going to be a lot of random memes in random spots, so get ready.
Flashback to the 1930s, a wonderful time to be alive, full of spooky dust clouds, a depressed economy, and dreams of rabbits.
Gonna have a little place and rabbits.
Head on up to Chicago. The black population is booming, and the real estate is basically racial monopoly. You know that one board game that really helps strengthen friendships? Well, imagine instead of going to a piece of property that isn't yours and going bankrupt, you now instead get bricks thrown at you and your family and have a lawsuit filed against you when going to a piece of property where your race isn't allowed. Oh, and they gave it a fancy, official-sounding name, Racially Restrictive Covenants. Very friendly and welcoming, if you ask me.
So 1938, Carl Augustus Hansberry.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Yes, he is the father of Lauren Hansberry, and his family, including young Lorraine, moved into Washington Park, a neighborhood in which one of these covenants was in place that banned black families. Why did he move in, you may ask? Well, black real estate was in high demand due to the expanding black population, and that made it much more expensive. White real estate, though, was much cheaper and not so much in demand, partially due to the Depression. But who would have guessed what would happen when Lorraine was almost hit with a brick and the Woodlawn Properties Association, who oversaw the neighborhood, filed a lawsuit against Carl.
Carl, what did you do?
So initially, the case goes to the Circuit Court of Illinois, a lower federal court for the state. The argument boils down to this. Anna Lee and her fellow plaintiffs representing the association wants the Hansberrys to be forced out of their new home for violating the covenant and keep Washington Park all white, while Hansberry and his defendants are like,
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more!
and argue that the covenant is invalid and doesn't apply to them. Basically, the covenant works so that it is only effective if 95% of homeowners agree with it, and at that moment, only 54% had signed on. But Lee argued the covenant was valid from an earlier vote and case, the Burke v. Kleinman trial, even if that trial had not included Hansberry and the African-American population he represented. So naturally, Hansberry argued how the heck could they be bound to a vote that they weren't included in. There's an entire argument over whether or not the Burke v. Kleinman trial was class action, as it involved a number of individuals who have similar backgrounds. But in the end, the Circuit Court ruled that the African-American community are bound to this vote and covenant and are bound to the Burke v. Kleinman case in 1934, therefore interpreting it as class action. And the Supreme Court of Illinois supported the ruling, so Hansberry and his family were facing the boot and were asked to leave the neighborhood.
So Carl was like,
Why?
but he wasn't done yet, so he decides to have the case taken to the Supreme Court, as the Circuit Court's ruling was solely based off the Burke v. Kleinman Supreme Court case, so it could be subject to review if Hansberry and his defendants appealed for it. Hence, the Hansberry v. Lee case officially came to be. And guess what? Hansberry actually won the case. The Supreme Court only looked at whether the previous Burke v. Kleinman case qualified as class action, not really getting involved as to whether or not the covenants were constitutional. The official ruling by the court was the defendants in the first suit were not treated by the pleadings or decree as representing others or as foreclosing by their defense the rights of others. Now, in English and not fancy law terms, basically that means that Hansberry and his defendants were not bound to the Burke v. Kleinman case, as that case's ruling had not counted as class action. Therefore, the covenant was not applied to Hansberry and the African American community of Chicago. Now, there are a bunch of other specific details about this case, as it is well documented, and if you are looking into going into law, then I'm sure this stuff will be quite interesting, but we got another subject to talk about.
Lorraine Vivian Hansberry III, born May 19, 1930, author of A Good Old Raisin in the Sun, that I definitely read. Right, Miss Kober? Daughter of the man who allowed blacks to move into covenant areas, granddaughter of a slave, and quite the life, short as it was. Needless to say, she had quite the childhood with her father in the Supreme Court, bricks being thrown through the windows of her house when she was 8, and being the youngest of 4 by 7 years. Her parents were also constantly involved with the NAACP and other civil rights organizations. And if you ask me, I think being the youngest was the most scarring experience for young Lorraine the most. Call me crazy, but be honest. Which sounds more appealing, a brick to the face or dealing with older siblings? I think we all know the answer.
But back to being on task and not getting enough, Lorraine would go on to attend the University of Wisconsin, initially being an art major before switching to writing, then dropping out of college and moving to New York City after 2 years. In New York, though, she went to the New School for Social Research and would write for the newspaper Freedom, a progressive black paper, throughout 1950 to 1953. She would also work as a waitress and cashier, along with writing on her own on the side. In 1957, she would contribute to the latter, in which she wrote on feminism and homophobia, although her lesbian identity was revealed as she wrote under her initials. And yes, you heard me correctly, Lorraine Hansberry did indeed have a lesbian side, although she married Robert Nemiroff in 1953. The two did divorce, though, in 1962, although they still closely interacted with one another.
Now, 1959, Hansberry's writing on the side while working as a waitress and a cashier turned into the play that we all know and love, A Raisin in the Sun. Quote, the play opened at the Ethel Barrymore Theater on March 11, 1959, and was a great success, having a run of 530 performances, unquote. This made Hansberry the first black playwright, and black female playwright at that, to win a New York Critics Circle Award. In 1961, a film of the play starring Mr. Sidney Poitier was created, which won an award at the Cannes Film Festival.
Unfortunately for Lorraine, this would be the peak of her writing career. However, in 1963, Hansberry became active in the civil rights movement, along with other influential people, including Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, and James Baldwin. Hansberry met with then Attorney General Robert Kennedy to test his position on civil rights. Hansberry would release another play, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, in 1964, although it pales in comparison to the success of her first play. That same year, unfortunately, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, dying on January 12, 1965, at 34. After her death, Nemiroff compiled her work and interviews into the play to be young, gifted, and black, as a final send-off to Hansberry.
Looking back at her life, I'm sure you can tell that there are a lot of parallels between Hansberry's life and Raisin. You have the all-white neighborhoods of Chicago, although for the younger family, it wasn't illegal to move into Clybourne Park, unlike the Hansberrys. There's the action of attempted removal of the two families, the lawsuit, and the bribery.
Well, you see, in the face of all the things I've said, we're prepared to make your family a very generous offer.
30 pieces and not a coin less.
Yeah.
Our association is prepared, through the collective efforts of our people, to buy the house from you at a financial gain to your family.
Also, the violence of black families in white neighborhoods was ever present in Lorraine's life and is a looming threat for the youngers. In the wise words of Mrs. Johnson,
Lord, I bet this time next month, y'all's names will have been in the paper aplenty. Negroes invade Clybourne Park. Bomb.
the character of Benitha also in a way is the representation of Hansberry and her feminist and civil rights ideals, and the idea of a black woman trying to pursue her dreams in a world that is telling her no.
As for Carl Hansberry's Supreme Court case, his victory meant that restrictive covenants were ineffective in Chicago, allowing black families to move into white neighborhoods and allow integration. It was also a breath of relief for black families struggling to buy a home, as now the market would open for them to cheaper white real estate. In fact, we see this in Raisin, as Mama explained her decision to move into Clybourne Park.
Them houses they put up for coloreds in them areas way out all seem to cost twice as much as other houses. I did the best I could.
While this was not a full-out ban on racial covenants for the entire country, Hansberry would be the catalyst for the case that would, the Shelley versus Kramer trial. And while Lorraine's play may have been more focused on human drama, there are social implications that reflect her father's trial and the past that she'd grown up in. Well, that being said, I guess the video is just about done. I hope you actually learned something, and remember kids, don't play Monopoly. It never ends well.